Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 23rd of November. In today's video, we're primarily focusing on the Velyka Novosilka front as the Russians have gained a lot of territory over the past 24 hours. We'll also look at the front south of Pokrovsk and in Toretsk. But in particular, I want to focus on topography and order of battle for the Russian and Ukrainian forces alike, not just around Velyka Novosilka, but also in areas slightly to the east. I want to go through the composition of the units for both sides. Let's begin with this advance east of the city. Here you can see 47.7 square kilometers of territory being taken over by the Russian forces within what is largely 24 hours, maybe a bit more. This is being reported upon by Russian and Ukrainian sources alike, but Ukrainians in particular are mentioning this. They're mentioning several axes of Russian advances, most notably the one that is in between the Shaitanka and Kashlach rivers. You can see them on the map over here. So sandwiched in between those areas is this open field region that includes a highway. There aren't a lot of Ukrainian defensive obstacles in between the Russian line of contact and the Velyka Novosilka here, so it was the perfect area for a Russian advance. So the Russians, they were able to push forward nearly 5 kilometers westwards. And now, if we're measuring it, they are only, let's see, a couple hundred meters away from the warehouses on the outskirts and some of the trenches that are supposed to protect it nearby. They're also about 2 kilometers away from Velyka Novosilka itself. So this comes following footage released by the 3rd and 20th Mechanized Battalions of the Separate Presidential Brigade. So now there are 2 battalions of this particular unit that are operating in Velyka Novosilka. Previously, I thought there was only 1, but there are 2. And again, some of the elements that you're going to look at later on in the video have been moved pretty recently to defend in Velyka Novosilka to boost up what was previously a really lackluster garrison of Ukrainian forces, and I believe still is to a certain extent when you're going to compare it to the size of the Russian garrison over here, but also the quality of the forces. But in any case, the 2 battalions here, the 3rd and 20th, they're actually some of Ukraine's strongest units in this region. And they released footage of FPV strikes showing 2 destroyed MTLBs, 2 abandoned tanks, 1 destroyed tank, and 1 damaged tank. This was done in conjunction with several Ukrainian drone groups, including the Chimera drone units of the 126th TDF Brigade. Also, the Bulava drone unit, I believe they are associated with the 72nd Brigade, but they are attached to various other units whenever their operations are needed elsewhere. And also the Nova drone group, and I've never heard of them before, but they were mentioned in the reporting. So that's one way of looking at the footage. The footage that was released and geolocated from the 3rd and 20th battalions occurred over here, and this is one of Russia's deepest infiltrations along this open field area sandwiched in between the 2 rivers. But that's not the only area where attacks occurred by the Russian side. You also had the 17th National Guard Brigade. They released footage and they claimed that they destroyed 2 tanks and 6 armored vehicles and repelled 14 Russian assaults today. Now, their footage, a lot of it also comes from the same area, and there may be some overlap in between the claims of what the Presidential Brigade destroyed and what the 17th National Guard Brigade destroyed. So I can't say that it is larger than it actually is. We have to wait and see if there's any sort of overlap. But in any case, it does indicate to us that this unit is also operating around here and is providing a defensive cushion for the Ukrainian side. At the same time, Deep State reported on tanks landing just southeast of Velyka Novosilka, saying that in addition to that, 1 out of 5 armored vehicles were actually able to infiltrate into the urban cluster itself, in addition to 6 armored fighting vehicles that made it into Rozdolnia further to the north. I'll show you guys that right now, and they were able to dismount infantry. So that is mimicking the reports coming from Rybar claiming that Russian forces were able to infiltrate into the outskirts of the settlements and that clashes are now going on. You can see how I'm reflecting with that on my map over here. The eastern side is currently in a gray zone. The Russian forces have been geolocated a bit to the south today. Here in this video, it's a 5-vehicle column from the 40th Marine Brigade capturing a trench south of Rozdolnia. So they cross over large swaths of open fields, largely unprotected. The Ukrainians do not have the means to dig in over here. There are only a few isolated, strong points, and they really can't withstand large-scale Russian assaults. And so the Russians advanced here 2.3 kilometers westwards. And the lead tank, in addition to the armored fighting vehicles, provided suppressive fire towards whatever Ukrainians were entrenched over here in tree lines or in this particular trench. And from there, troops dismounted and took over the location, all with the goal of cutting off the southern flank of Rozdolnia and then having the opportunity to push from the south and reach the agricultural areas over here. Also, it means that the Russians if we're measuring it right now, are only about 2.7 kilometers away from the highway connecting Rozdolnya to Velyka Novosilka. Because even in a worst case scenario where Rozdolnya were to fall immediately to the Russian side, the Ukrainians would at least have solace in the fact that they have the highway under their control and then this local strong point protecting it. But if the Russians are to continue pushing to the south of Rozdolnya, they'll have a perfect and open route to cut off that logistics point as well. And even though they have not done that yet, the pressure that is mounting on the Ukrainians that are moving in and out of this road on a daily basis is becoming very significant. And it's mainly affecting the 128th Mountain Assault Brigade in this area. So you have 40th Naval Infantry Brigade, mainly associated with the pushes over here to the northwest of Shakhtarska. And by the way, in Shakhtarska today, there was footage released of one Ukrainian POW being captured, but I believe it's a relatively old video from when the town fell. And here you have the 5th Guard Tank Brigade. They are involved with a lot of the pushes that we saw earlier today from the Zolota Niva Highway. In addition, we have reporting from Deep State last night of this Russian advance amounting to nearly 10 square kilometers, further pushes west of Maximivka, north of Yazda Poliana, areas that the Ukrainians simply cannot defend because of a lack of depth. The units that have been moved in, and there have been a lot, Ukrainian forces, they are currently, becoming accustomed to this front and are looking for more favorable positions where they can dig in for a longer period of time, not for these sort of transit stages. It's just, drag out fighting for the Russian forces that will inevitably push forward regardless. But you could see here the Russians gaining 2.7 kilometers and advancing along this paved road. This paved road is dangerous because if the Russians continue to utilize it, they will make their way to Rozliv, which is right now about, let's say, 5 kilometers from the Ukrainian line of contact. And then from there, you have access to the highway, this highway that's horizontal. And this highway, not only does it connect to Velyka Novosilka, but it's much more significant than that. It crosses over the Mokriali River, crosses over the Vavcha River into various rear bases, Ukrainian rear artillery bases, command and control hubs, whatever it may be, logistics points, distribution centers. And those are located on the Dnipro side of the border and then act as a conduit into southern Donetsk. A lot of them also reach Komar, which acts as a local supply hub as well. And that's all due to the access that this highway provides for all of those cities to, remain connected. So there is a really big threat of that highway being cut off in the potential scenario where the Russians were to advance northwards into Rozliv. So definitely keep that in mind. And then also, that's also part of the first step that the Russians would take in order to reach southern Andrivka. Because from there, after capture of Rozli, for instance, you have Konstantopil, Ulakli, and then Andrivka. And there just is a lack of protection here that is undeniable based on the way that the trenches are being dug. The Ukrainians that have been moved in as reinforcements, they're going to obviously spend a lot of the coming weeks preparing intensely and trying to build up as much as they can, but they can't do anything too significant because the front line is too close to them and they won't have enough time on their hands regardless. So if we're looking at the Ukrainian reinforcements, I'm not going to get into too much detail just yet, but there are a lot of territorial defense units. It's a lower caliber force in this area because the Ukrainians are not in immediate threat of encirclement here. They're not in threats of losing a major settlement in these areas. So the Ukrainians, they're sort of trading the quality of the units and compensating for that with this, I suppose, 7.5 kilometer buffer zone in between the line of contact and southern Andrivka. Whereas the higher caliber units are involved in the fighting a bit to the east, where you are witnessing a situation with a huge pocket that has to be held onto, or then to the west, Velyka Novosilka has to be fought over. Same thing with Kharkov, really engaged in a fierce urban battle over there. So those are where the Ukrainian priorities currently are at. But you can look at the reinforcements here. There definitely are some, and they are necessary in order to keep a stable front line. But again, the caliber is a bit lower. 113th Kharkiv Territorial Defense Brigade moved from the, I believe, Lipsy sector, might have been on the border in Kharkiv. And you also have over here a few other isolated battalions that are not attached to their mother units, like this one over here. And for now, they have been able to, man the line here, but definitely not prevent the Russians from further gaining control of open fields north of the villages that they have already captured. Now, looking a bit to the east, we have here in Dalnya, I think there was additional footage recently confirming, strong Russian presence over here. but that's neither here nor there. Oh yeah, here for Ukrainian POWs taken in Dolnya. I think I talked about that yesterday. And a bit to the north, we have Kurakove. Russian sources are reporting a complete capture of the eastern district. So far, I can't verify that, but they also claim to have crossed over the floodplain, dividing Kurakove into two sections. You could see that floodplain over here. They claim to have crossed over, and that there's fighting ongoing in the elevator grain, in the warehouses over here, and in buildings next to school number 4. So that's a local high school. They have not reached it yet, but according to Russian sources, they have been able to capture some of the buildings that are located just to the east of it. So that will be the next phase of the direct urban clashes in Kurakova if this were to be confirmed true, because the Ukrainians for the past week, they've been relying on this floodplain as a dividing line to ensure that Russians don't approach closer, because whenever they would, you'd have Ukrainian drone cruiser, infantry on the ground try to fire upon them. And it is a difficult task in such a really, really difficult battlefield to cross and traverse 200 meters of open space. So we'll have to see if that ends up being true, because then the Russians will have direct access to a lot of the more dense portions of the city that definitely have to be taken over, such that the Russians will then have the opportunity to take over Krakow in its entirety. You're looking at northern Krakow. There are just huge quantities of buildings, really well fortified buildings, and then span westwards to the area near the reservoir and the industrial zones like the thermal power plants. So those are really, really difficult targets to surmount. But the Russians are currently in the process of doing that, with Russian sources claiming control over 30 to 35% of the city. But we have to wait for confirmation from the Ukrainian side or some sort of geolocation. So now let's look at the order of battles that the Russian and Ukrainian sides have. You could see here that I divided the Russian fronts into 4 sections. This is because the Russian battalions, brigades, regiments, whatever it may be, they are more compartmentalized than the Ukrainian side, in the sense that they can focus on a singular area without having, having the necessity to be moved to another part of the front line that may be a couple of kilometers away to engage in a critical task, because the Russians do have the abundance needed in order to have each unit assigned to a specific area and then not be moved elsewhere, when it would be better for all parties involved to remain in the same spot. So we'll see how that manifests itself in a second. So you can see here that I drew in red Russian front south of Velyka Novosilka, one east of Velyka Novosilka that we talked about today with the large scale advances. Then these fields in between eastern Velyka Novosilka and Uspenivka, basically all of the locations north of Vuhledar that were captured in the rapid spree of Russian captures of villages and are now located south of Andrivka. So you have a garrison of Russian forces over there. And then you have the groupings that are positioned around the Uspenivka pockets and that are tasked with taking it over in its entirety. For the Ukrainian side, I'm going to mark it as a more unified front. I'm going to leave it as 2 fronts actually instead of 4. And that includes the entire Velyka Novosilka area, because you do have a lot of times Ukrainian forces that may be defending to the east being moved southwards to repel any attacks, because they don't have an abundance needed to divide them up and allow them to focus on one area. So they're moved back and forth. It's not a massive inconvenience, because this front line is pretty small, but it does speak to the lack of parity between both sides, especially in Velyka Novosilka. So I'm just going to count it as one part of the front line. And the other part of the front line that we're looking at is south of Andrivka, and I'm going to couple that with the pockets southeast of Uspenivka and just consider their sizes and strength together as a single unified body. So let's begin with the Russian side. We're going to look at their forces specifically south of Velyka Novosilka, which I would estimate to be around 15,000, because you have a range of between 7,400 to 20,000. And in this case, I'm going to try to go down pretty close to the middle, leaning towards the larger side. You have a lot of brigades from the 127th Motor Rifle Division located over here. And that's the main Russian garrison involved with fighting in Novodarivka, Levadne, Rivnopil, for instance. Rivnopil has been taken over by the Russians, but the clashes have largely subsided besides some fighting a bit to the east of it. The Russians are not currently focusing on pushing it further northwards. Where they are pushing, as we all know, is east of Velyka Novosilka. And here you have a range that's even more broad, between 7,800 troops to 28,000. And I'm going to go with an estimate of around 17,000 for this area. And of course, I could be off. But we're trying to work our way down the middle, but maybe push slightly closer to the larger end of the estimates in certain areas where it may be appropriate based on the sizes of the units and how much we've seen of them recently. And in this area, as we talked about, you have 5th Tank Brigade, 40th Naval Infantry Brigade. There's a few other units that are involved as well, like the 37th Motor Rifle Brigade, and I believe they're tasked with an area south of the Shaitanka River and may be involved in fighting along this ridge leading to the area directly south of the city. So they're also counted within this compilation and math. Now, with the central sector south of Andrivka, you're looking at, again, very broad range between 8,900 men to 34,000. That's because you have a lot of brigades, and the size of Russian brigades is more ambiguous than the size of, say, a regiment or a battalion. In a lot of cases, you have really massive Russian brigades that include so many different regiments within them. That happens in a lot of cases, and then that skews the numbers upwards. And sometimes it's a lot smaller, and that's why there's a range of between 2,000 to 8,000 Russian soldiers within a brigade. That's the classification, and it creates a lot of ambiguity. But I'm going to go with an estimate of around 18,000. I'm not going to put it higher because I don't think there is a massive Russian concentration in this area, just because the intensity of the fighting here has been slightly lower than it is to the east of Velyka Novosilka or around the Uspanika pockets. But again, 18,000 is still a large chunk, and it's actually larger when you add it up in absolute terms compared to the other two fronts that we discussed. Looking at this front line that I'm referring to, it's just to the basically east of Rozdolnya, all the way to the area south of Uspanivka, so 20 kilometers. Now, lastly, we're looking at the area spanning from Trudova, I would say, all the way to Ilinka. So this area over here, basically a 13-kilometer semicircle. I'm not really looking at Dalnya in this case because at that point you're already going to focus on Kurakova, and that's not necessarily my point with this addition. So in this area, there are a lot of well-known active Russian units that we've talked about. There's a few ones that I recently added in after looking at reporting from videos or just social media posts discussing the activities of these units. So there's a few ones without even logos because they're not really well known. But the main ones are 39th Brigade pushing from the south over here, 33rd Regiment. They're really involved in the really difficult fighting in Antonivka, Ilinka, Elizavetivka, etc. And when you add up their numbers, it's between 7,850 to 25,000 men. So on this front, I'm going to go a bit on the higher end of the ranges and closer to the maximum of 25,000 and say it's around 18,000. So then when you add up all the numbers, it should be 68,000 for the Russian garrison, starting in southern Velyka Novosilka all the way to this area to the east over here that is pretty close to Kurakova itself. And I would say, based on my own estimates, now just adding it up, it would probably be also in the ballpark of 68,000, maybe a bit less, 60,000, but somewhere in that range would not be too far fetched. And now for the Ukrainian side, I do want to give some honorable mentions to recent units that were moved in. That includes the 32nd Mechanized Brigade. They were quietly sent to this front. It wasn't really made much fanfare of, but it was really involved in defensive activity for a while in Toretsk. And then it sort of died down, and I forgot about the unit's existence. And then I just wondered where it was eventually. And now I go to check, and I see that it's actually operating west of Velyka Novosilka, probably in the Novodarivka Rivnopil region. So this is probably one of the strongest Ukrainian units that could have been sent in, has a lot of defensive experience, and has one of the more modern arsenals. So that's a good addition for the Ukrainian defensive forces over here. And there were, of course, a few other territorial defense battalions involved, all in addition to the battalions from the Presidential Brigade. So when you look at the size, adding it all up, it probably is around 14,000. Maybe less because, again, we have to say that we're assuming the Ukrainian units on paper are not necessarily at full strength, but aren't severely depleted. And I can see that for sure in some cases for units that have been engaged in frontline fighting in intense areas for a very long period of time. But for instance, with the 32nd Brigade, it hasn't really seen that much combat over the past few months. So I do think they may have had enough time to replenish. So we'll go for 14,000 Ukrainian soldiers in this area, south and east of the urban cluster, versus about 32,000 Russian soldiers operating in the same two areas. Now, when it comes to the central front and the Uspanivka pockets, you have even larger Ukrainian garrisons. We looked at it, territorial defense units that were moved in, 37th Marine Brigade, 72nd Mechanized Brigade, 79th Air Assault Brigade. You have the support from the 33rd Mechanized Brigade. And I'm sort of like overestimating the Ukrainian number because the 33rd Brigade is both operating over here north of Velyka, but is also defending in the Dalnya region. And so it's sort of like in this limbo area in between the Usmanivka pockets and the Kurakova front. But I'm just gonna give it as in consideration and add it up into the total Ukrainian number for the Usmanivka pockets, just to increase your number slightly. So when you add it all up for the Ukrainian forces in this region, and I'll measure the size of it for you guys so you guys get a reference point, this region that spans around 25, 26 kilometers, you have around 22,000 Ukrainian soldiers. In comparison, the Russians have 36,000. So that is my estimate for both sides. Hopefully that is informative, and you see that it is slightly larger than 2 to 1, and reaches probably 3 to 1 if there is some sort of deficiency in the Ukrainian staffing at the front line. Now, to just quickly look at a few other updates, south of Pustinka, the Russian forces have been able to advance 0.7 square kilometers. They cut off the road between Yurivka and Pustinka, are now very close to the settlement itself. So now much of it is in a gray zone as the Russians are planning to storm it from the south upwards to the north, pushing along various tree lines, ponds, gullies, etc. But it is a small settlement, as I said before. And so once the Russians really go all in for it, there's not going to be much to go through for them to take it over in its entirety. A bit to the north over here in Toretsk, you have reports from Deep State, not necessarily new, but it's just confirmation of earlier reporting of the large-scale Russian gains occurring around the southern part of the Zabalka district. But now you're seeing even more parts of the southern district of Toretsk being taken over by the Russians around the school area, a few duplexes, a few apartment complexes as well. And now we still don't know what's going on with this eastern part of Zabalka. It's probably in the gray zone. That's what Deep State is saying. And that means the Russians have an opportunity to push over here and secure additional territory, which would really strengthen the southern flank of the Russian grouping in central Toretsk, which is currently putting a lot of pressure on apartment buildings and on the various mines and landfills in western Toretsk. Just as a final update, I want to show you guys a slight Russian advance that occurred today, and that is just to the northeast of Terny. You can see over here the Russians gaining 2 square kilometers based on footage that you have over here from November 23rd of the 60th Mechanized Brigade destroying a Russian BTR-82A and BMP. Dismounts were able to escape from those vehicles, but they were then hit by FPVs and grenades in the same valley. The Russians advanced, I believe, along this axis, indicating control over additional territory, including some forested areas. It's also a means by which they were able to strengthen their positions, their eastern flank, I would say, of their forward positions in northern Terny. But again, a lot of the dismounted troops were also then targeted by drones in the process, leading to casualties. What it does mean is that now you have reports of the Russians infiltrating into northern Terny and also northeast of it, meaning that the Russians really are putting in much more efforts into taking over the settlements in comparison to some of the fighting that you're seeing a bit to the south, which is much more static in nature. And again, the Russians really are trying to advance along this specific routes of the paved road running southwards and also running parallel to the Zherebets River to finally push the Ukrainians out of the Zherebets River Valley. And so that's all I have for today. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.